Take you straight to New York, where our UN correspondent Sherwin Bryce-Pease is standing by. Sherwin, you were there for that jovial moment we've just shown. How is Trump's speech being digested?
Well, I wouldn't call it a jovial moment. I think it was an embarrassing moment for the United States President to be laughed at by the General Assembly because he made such an outrageous statement, an unbelievable statement, saying that in less than 2 years of his administration, he had achieved more than any administration in the history of the United States, the oldest democracy in the world. I mean, it's quite an astonishing thing to say. And so I don't think this was a moment of levity necessarily. It was kind of a strange moment, and you saw the reaction there of the president saying that he actually didn't expect that reaction, and I mean that really just speaks to so much. And look, also a very dark speech. I mean, at a United Nations General Assembly where the focus is really about placing the United Nations back at the center. The Secretary General in his speech earlier in the day talking about the importance of multilateralism, the importance of the rules-based international system, working hard to regain the trust it has lost, whether you're talking about its inability to stop wars in Syria, Yemen and elsewhere, the Rohingya crisis he cited. There's a real cause here for the UN Secretariat under the leadership of Antonio Guterres to get everybody around the table so that they can fix the world's ills. And what you heard then from President Donald Trump is again this unilateral approach to world issues, whether you're talking about his domestic achievements in terms of the economy, domestic achievements in terms of security, the U.S. disposition under the America First policy to refugees. Of course, a very big blight on the world image right now is its inability to deal with a really massive refugee crisis, boasting that, you know, the United States had withdrawn from the refugee compact, the migration compact that was adopted earlier this year. Francis, he also talked about, justified their reasoning for withdrawing from the Human Rights Council in Geneva, saying that they will not return until real reform is enacted. He again followed his National Security Advisor John Bolton's speech on their view of the International Criminal Court. He talked about the ICC having no jurisdiction, no legitimacy and no authority, that the American sovereignty would never be surrendered to an unelected bureaucracy. He rejected the ideology of globalism and embraced patriotism. And I think it cannot be lost on anyone that this is a president that whenever he gives a speech, even at a multilateral fora like the United Nations, always has his electoral base in mind. And do not forget that we are going to an election on November 6th where one or two of the levers of the United States government could be lost to the Democratic Party. This is a president that is also concerned with possible impeachment. He doesn't know what the Robert Mueller special counsel investigation has on him. Of course, we all await the findings of that investigation. But talking about the sort of domestic gains in terms of what the stock market is doing, how much you've added to the U.S. economy, really had very little to do with the substance of what this gathering at the United Nations is about.
Sherwin, so there was some applause for people who weren't there. How do we interpret that? I mean, there's been a lot of talk of the politics of pessimism, of all the problems, and for some people, he's the poster boy of all of that.
Well, people tend to clap their hands when they laugh out loud, don't they? It's kind of like a physical reaction. You go, oh my gosh, and clap your hands. And I think there might have been a smattering of trying to move the uncomfortable moment forward. And that's probably why you heard applause. I mean, this was not an applause-worthy moment. This was the president saying that he had done more than any president in the history of the world. I mean, it's kind of ridiculous. So I think that's what they were reacting to, Francis. And it undermines, I think, the seriousness of what the Secretary General is trying to do, the reforms that are required at the United Nations. When you're talking about the implausible composition of the current makeup of the UN Security Council, a representation of the end of the Second World War, and really not taking into consideration the geopolitics, the nature of 21st century geopolitics, and certainly the cries you hear from Africa about wanting 2 seats and 5 non-permanent seats, 2 permanent seats, 5 non-permanent seats, because 70% of the Security Council agenda deals with African issues. He did also talk, though, about, and let's give the president some credit here, he did also talk about some of the successes in terms of the détente we are seeing with North Korea. Kim Jong-un went from rocket man to being called by his actual name in this address by the president. He also talks about Iran and how justified the withdrawal of the United States from the JCPOA, that fundamental nuclear agreement that world powers had negotiated with Iran for years. The United States now withdrawing from that and imposing punitive measures against the Iranian government, arguing that with the lifting of sanctions in terms of the JCPOA, that money has gone straight into Iran's military, and he talked about the destabilizing role Tehran has in the Middle East. So he did talk a bit about foreign policy, and people can decide exactly if that was the right approach from Washington or not.
Sherwin, final question on Trump. He targeted OPEC as well, and I mean, for South Africa it would be great if fuel prices came down. Is that something of a new focus? There are a lot of time on OPEC, on that oil producing cartel.
Well, I think when we think about the United States and how President Donald Trump has based his domestic policy, it is based purely on the success of the U.S. economy, right? I mean, the tax cuts that were enacted by this administration have at their core the fact that they expect United States growth to pay for that tax cut to be in excess of 3-4%. And that's kind of what he's earmarking in terms of justifying that major tax cut that has added to the United States debt. And so when you see oil prices ticking up, gas prices, petrol prices, I mean, a similar concern in the United States as to what South Africans are going through. People drive cars in this country, perhaps not where we are in New York, but certainly around the rest of the country. And so there's a big concern that the increase in oil prices are really hitting people's pockets hard. And this is why he's taking them on as directly as he had. It's quite unprecedented for a United States president to make that kind of statement in the UN General Assembly. And I'd be very interested to hear what even allies like Saudi Arabia, the biggest oil producer in the world, and other OPEC members have to say in response.
So provocative, if nothing else. Thank you very much, Sherwin. Hopefully we'll check in with you soon on some of the other events. And of course, President Cyril Ramaphosa speaking before that UN General Assembly a little bit later. That was Sherwin Bryce-Pease, our UN correspondent.